It's Hollywood or history, unravel what they portray. Let's investigate, teaching truth, one frame at a time.
Welcome to the Hollywood or History Podcast, a podcast to help social studies teachers and teacher educators use film effectively in their classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Scott Roberts, and in each episode, we talk with a volume editor and lesson plan developer to determine the accuracy of their favorite films.
Hollywood or history, unravel what they portray. Let's investigate, teaching truth, one frame at a time.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Hollywood or History Podcast. This episode is about our trauma volume, the fourth volume chronologically in the series. I'm here today with Dr. Paul Yoder and Dr. Leona Calkins to discuss their work in the book. Welcome, Paul. Welcome, Leona.
Thank you so much, Scott. My name is Paul Yoder. I teach at a small liberal arts school in Virginia, in Harrisonburg, Virginia. I earned my PhD from the University of Virginia, so this is home for me, and I appreciate this opportunity.
Awesome. Thanks for being here, Paul. And Leona, can you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, hi. Thanks for having me, Scott. My name is Leona Calkins, and I earned my PhD in teacher education from the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. Currently, I'm an assistant professor of teacher education at California State University, Stanislaus, and it's in the Central Valley of California, a smaller town named Turlock. I'm social studies methods for the most part, but I do a lot of general methods as well, and taught high school history for over a decade.
Excellent. Well, welcome to the podcast. I'm looking forward to talking about your very, very interesting and powerful book concerning trauma and social studies. So let's kind of dive right into it. So again, this volume discusses issues of trauma throughout history and social studies. So can you tell us more, Paul, about what led to your interest in this topic, as well as kind of the process you had for writing a book about this topic as well?
Awesome. Well, thanks, Scott. As I was reflecting in preparation for today's conversation, it took me back to sitting in my bedroom during COVID lockdown. I set up a desk there. And so my co-editor, Aaron Johnson, and I really dreamed up this book during the pandemic, during that lockdown phase of life, which is, about 5 years ago now. And the collective trauma that all humans, all of us as educators experienced during the pandemic certainly plays a factor in this story. And I also am reminded in the way that the sort of the racial reckoning, the awareness, the Black Lives Matter conversation around racial violence, discrimination, and sort of that historical trauma was also a really important piece. So what we talk about in the introduction to the book is sort of those two components. And for me personally, as I engaged this conversation, I was very much drawing on a series of trainings, of seminars that I had participated in as a faculty member. I'm thankful for a program called Strategies in Trauma Awareness and Resilience. It's called the STAR program at my university. And so this was not simply sort of an academic exercise, but very much thinking about that experiential element, that trauma is something that as humans, we feel it, we can think about it, we can learn vocabulary, but we feel it. And that's something that I am confident is happening in our elementary and middle and high school classrooms when students are learning about these traumatic or traumagenic content in social studies. They're needing to figure it out, right? And so that was really sort of the impetus, the push to say, let's have this conversation. Let's use a resource like Hollywood or history or Hollywood to talk about how film brings that into the conversation. So what I'll just add is, in terms of the process, it was such a wonderful community building exercise to send emails, to dream, to be in conversation with colleagues like Leona, because we were not having these conversations on accident by running into each other at conferences or in classrooms during the pandemic. And so Aaron and I tried to sort of set the table, but then each of the different chapter authors were bringing their own, not just content knowledge in terms of what does a certain set of social studies standards tell us we have to teach, but also what have we experienced in classrooms? How do students of different ages grapple with things that are difficult or controversial? And when we think about this word traumagenic, how does history, current events, other social studies content cause trauma, or how might it cause trauma? One of the really helpful words that I learned in this seminar that I mentioned some years ago was traumagenic. And I always go back to the word carcinogenic. Something might cause cancer. So we're exposed to lots of things in our environment, and some of us develop cancer from those carcinogenic entities. And the same thing is true with the different social studies content, the different collective experiences we have, where some of our students, some of our community members are experiencing those in traumatic ways. And with other content, maybe watching a movie about the Revolutionary War or World War II, some of our students are not experiencing anything physiologically, or it's not a particularly emotional experience for them. But for other students, maybe because of their lived experiences or their positionality, sort of how they relate to the people who are in the story, or other variables, do experience that. So it's both what is in the content itself, and then also thinking about what's happening in the classrooms.
Yeah, and you bring up the pandemic, and I'll never forget. I think you and three other volume editors sent me emails around the same time during the pandemic, asking to write volumes in the series. I'm like, great, cool. I'm gonna have something to do during lockdown. Geez, I didn't think it was gonna have anything to do at all, but now I'm gonna be pretty busy. So that was welcoming to me to actually have something to do during the early stages of the pandemic when we had no idea when or if things would ever open up. And again, that certainly was traumatic to all of us, especially those students now who were probably all teaching at the university level. So I think even though your book came out during the pandemic or a little bit maybe after, it's certainly timely because we're going to have memories of the pandemic along with these other traumatic events for the rest of our lives. So I think it's a very important volume in the series for that reason as well. Real quick, Paul, can you tell us the audience about some of the films that were examined in the book?
Absolutely. So we're going to focus on Hotel Rwanda here today. As I went back, I had to remind myself, right? Because, these conversations have taken place over a number of years. One of the films that I want to highlight is an episode from Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood. So very much one of these elementary age outlets. And the specific episode was talking about natural disasters and how do we think about being prepared for a storm. And the characters are identifying their fears, their concerns, and then what they're doing about it. Now, I want to be really clear that this is for young children, right? And so it's in some ways oversimplified, but the very simple narrative is something that we extrapolate with older children, with secondary students, and with ourselves as adults as well, right? When we face something really difficult, in order to face it, in order to learn about it or to deal with it, we have to identify what is within our control, what can we do, and what is outside of our control, what do we have to let go of or simply talk about with someone else, and then recognize that we can't control it. And so these two words of resistance, something that we're trying to actively address or try to prevent. So in storm preparedness, for example, hammering plywood over windows, right, would be a great example of resistance, where you can proactively take an action to try to prevent something bad from happening. And then the other key word, which is talked about all the time with trauma, is resilience. What is happening within individuals, within communities, within nature, within storm preparedness, where the bad thing happens, and then we respond to it in ways that promote life, in ways that promote health, in ways that rebuild. And so that's sort of that general outline of what are we trying to talk about in a classroom, for example, when it comes to trauma. In sort of broad strokes, we've organized the chapter to include war and genocide purposefully, because we know that's in the curriculum. It's very difficult to talk about. The literature is very clear, but we are going to talk about it. And so the trauma that's within those historical or contemporary events is going to be a part of the learning experience for students. The other piece, and this is probably pretty obvious, but the other piece that we've certainly named in the book is that even the things that aren't in the curriculum, but that students are bringing with them, also informs our conversations, right? So it's both who the students are and both the knowledge and the experiences they're bringing, as well as what is a part of the official curriculum. And so that combination is important. We also talk about historical trauma, political trauma. One of the historical examples that was felt especially salient in the context of the pandemic was using an episode of Downton Abbey, where there was that historical pandemic experience, and helping just to recognize that something that is completely overwhelming, and that's certainly how I experienced the pandemic as my life, as the world closed around me, is not necessarily new to the human experience. It's something that is new to my experience, but having some of that contextualization, having evidence of resilience, of how humans have adapted and survived and thrived or supported each other, even when maybe those big words feel very lofty, but just to know, like, we can do this is so powerful. So those are just a few examples.
Yeah, definitely. And again, for the audience, some of these volumes are for secondary only, some of them for
Mm.
elementary only. But your book is a K-12 focused book, correct?
Yes, it is. So I went back, and I do want to be transparent in that the majority of the articles are aligned to middle and high school standards, but we do have some of those examples, like the Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood, that are connected to elementary. And so I do want to, I think this is probably pretty probably intuitive for most of our listeners, as humans, as educators, perhaps as caregivers or parents themselves, that how we talk about this with a 6-year-old and a 12-year-old and an 18-year-old is going to greatly vary in terms of what does resistance and resilience look like? What are those capacities of the child, of the individual? So that, for example, we're not going to put a more graphic video film in front of younger children because of all of the developmental pieces that we're aware of, as well as the specific trauma conversation we're having in this volume, in terms of wanting to acknowledge trauma, but then also very intentionally pair it with that resistance and resilience. If we just traumatize and re-traumatize our students without equipping them, then that's certainly not the goal.
Yeah, definitely. And for the listeners, don't forget, if you haven't listened to prior episodes of the podcast, we certainly had an episode for a book about pre-K 5, a volume of the series, as well as a volume about war films. So Paul's book is kind of like right there in the middle, and again gives you some more useful lesson plans, whether you're teaching at the elementary level, middle level, or secondary level. And certainly, I use these volumes with my higher ed students, my teacher preparation students, to learn how to do inquiry based practices and lessons as well. So they definitely work for those college aged university students also. So great. Well, thanks, Paul. Thanks for discussing the book and how it came about. So again, you kind of talked a little bit already, but why trauma? Again, just to let remind the listeners, like, where does it fall in our curriculum? Why is it important for us as social studies teachers to teach it to our students, etc.?
Yeah, Scott, I really appreciate the opportunity to focus on that really important question. And the short answer is that when we try to ignore trauma, we are unsuccessful, because the concept of trauma, the trauma that is in the human experience and how it's in our curriculum, is pervasive or ubiquitous or just unavoidable. And so in this volume, the goal is to lean into that reality and to say, here are some of the challenging content, whether it's racism, whether it's war, whether it's hurricanes or disease, things that we are going to teach about. How do we teach them well? And so that's where that trauma piece comes in. In terms of the broader conversation, I've especially over the years noted how words like difficult or controversial get used. And sometimes they're used as a placeholder because we're not sure how else to talk about it. And I think that's okay. We don't always have to add as much complexity as possible. Sometimes we just sort of need to have a term and then focus on the other components that are on the plate. Other times, the part that does concern me is other times we use those words in order to avoid the difficult or the controversial. And we certainly see that not just in classrooms, but also in our sort of general political dialogue as well. And so the goal here with talking about trauma specifically is to start naming some of these components, to say it's difficult to talk about war because these historical actors experienced a lot of trauma. And it's very likely that if we actually talk about or look at, heaven forbid, look at pictures or video of what they experienced, that we will be traumatized. We'll have sort of that secondary or vicarious trauma. I remember being a 7th grade teacher and teaching the Holocaust. It was a part of the Virginia curriculum, so it wasn't something I was going out of my way to do. It was something that I was asked to teach. And I didn't really have the language to know how to talk about it. I didn't use the word trauma, but as I've listened and learned and read over the years, this idea of remembrance, that we simply want to hold space because this was very traumatic. And if we simply read about the experience of a child, perhaps the age of the students that we're teaching, and then say the bell rang, go to lunch or go to science class now, like, woof, that is a shift that is really not healthy for humans, to go from this is really deep and intense to let's pretend it's not relevant to your life anymore, from one period to the next. Or maybe we have a 2-week unit and we keep going in and out, in and out. So the goal here is just to provide some language, some suggestions around what it looks like to provide a little bit more space, a little bit more time to identify what is it that these historical actors are experiencing it, and what are we experiencing as the teachers and learners as we encounter this.
Yep, and that's an amazing example, and I'm glad you wrote or edited this book in order to address that question, because I felt the same thing, right? I used to be a Georgia history, Georgia studies teacher, 8th grade. We talk about, the Cherokee removal, and it's such a devastating event in the state of Georgia, very traumatic, obviously, for those that participated and to our students who are learning about it. And then, like you said, after, 55 minutes, all right, well, go to, PE, and then, and then of course with our standards, you had to kind of, quote unquote, move on. Right. So
Mhm.
I'm glad that you edited this book to kind of help teachers address that particular question and the feelings that your students have when
Mhm.
studying these traumatic events in history and social studies. Okay, well, great. Well, Leona, you speaking of a very, very traumatic event, I don't know how you transition from one to the other, but
Mhm.
you are looking at the film Hotel Rwanda, which is certainly a very traumatic event that is, I guess, compared to anything historical, is more recent. Definitely not super recent, but definitely more recent than maybe something like the Black Plague or something like that. Can you talk a little bit more about why you selected the film, and then for those that haven't seen the movie, maybe a brief background about it?
Yeah, so it's kind of three parts as to why I chose the film. One, it's a critically acclaimed film. It won multiple Academy Awards, one of them being for screenplay. And so going into it and thinking about films and recognizing that there's a great study done by Sam Weinberg about like people's understanding of history through films, that like a lot of times that's how we learn about it. So it's like, cool, I want to take this film that is well known, critically acclaimed, and maybe look into that. Additionally, in teaching world history, I taught world history for about 8 years. I found that many of my students viewed the Holocaust as an anomaly. Like, oh, this happened once. Hitler was this bad person and it happened this one time. And they didn't, for whatever reason, didn't necessarily recognize that it wasn't an anomaly, that genocides have existed throughout much of history in different capacities, and that it can still happen today. So that's another reason why I wanted to focus on something, I guess, more modern. Most modern, no, but more modern.
Right.
And then lastly, where I was teaching in Vegas, we had a high population of Eastern African refugees coming in. So none of them were Eastern Africa. A lot of them were Ethiopia, Sudan, South Sudan, with a lot of what was going on there. And so I thought about, even though Hotel Rwanda wasn't necessarily their perspective and their voice, a lot of what my students had faced back in their homes, you can see the trickle down from colonialism. And so when looking at Hotel Rwanda and the Rwandan genocide, there's definitely a piece there where you can connect it to colonialism. And a lot of what was happening in modern day, the countries of Africa, stems back to the partition of Africa. And so I just thought, like, how do I bring voices that my students, some of my newer students, could recognize and see almost themselves or their families in? Not identical, but I felt like, or I do feel like, world history, US history, any history class, that is the one place all of my students should be able to see themselves and hear their voices at some point in time throughout the year. And so this was kind of one of those ways where I'm like, how do I do this? And obviously what was happening in Sudan, or what happened in Sudan, I felt was a little too new. There was no films that I could really come across. So I thought Hotel Rwanda then was kind of like a good option to go with. And so in the sense of the film itself does cover the genocide in Rwanda, but it's through the perspective of a hotelier, Paul Rusabagina, who was a Hutu, and he was a general manager of a very well-known hotel, a very expensive hotel where a lot of tourists would come and visit. And during the genocide, he is known for helping save about 1,200 people, both Hutu and Tutsi, during this time, by using both his connections and then just his ability as a manager. Like anyone who was at the hotel, he is known for helping save these people and working with the UN, and the UN general who was there to eventually get the people evacuated to a refugee camp. And so the film really follows Paul and Paul's experience, although there are definitely aspects of the larger genocide that are presented in the film as well.
Well, thank you. Yeah, that's good. I think again, it was a well acclaimed movie. Probably a lot of folks saw it when it came out, but it may be one of those movies that there's a podcast called the Rewatchables. I'm not sure that will be on the Rewatchables for most people, even though it's important and certainly a useful film that a high school history teacher, world history teacher, can use to discuss this event. So what we do now in the podcast is we kind of go through the step by step approach of the Hollywood history strategy, talking about Leona, in your case, your experience going through that process and writing your lesson plan. So the first step is selections, right? When you are doing the Hollywood history strategy, you want to select state standards to help back up why you're actually teaching this lesson. And we make sure that all of our authors go to different states, 3 states usually per lesson, to kind of show the broad spectrum of state standards about these type of topics. And then certainly clips or parts of the film that go well with those standards. So if you could you talk a little bit more about the different standards you selected when it came to using Hotel Rwanda in the classroom?
Yeah, so to start off kind of nationally and looking at the NCSS and some of their core themes, looking at continuity and change. So how did Rwanda change but both before and during the time period? What led to this genocide? Was it just a spark that happened, or was it more tensions that were building? So looking at that change in continuity, looking at how different groups played a part in all of this. So that ties into their individual groups and institutions piece of NCSS. And then lastly, that global connectedness, because obviously when we think about, really the last several hundred years, we have been globally interconnected. So how has the rest of the world played a part in the genocide in Rwanda and or preventing or not preventing what happened when we think about the UN's role in all of this, as well as, countries like the United States that had, more power, that to what extent did they turn a blind eye to what was going on? So that's the overarching, like when we look at national NCSS themes, those were the 3 that I looked at. And then getting into Nevada, because that's where I was at. So that's kind of what I highlighted here. I did cover Nevada, California, and Illinois standards. Those are the 3 states I'm most familiar with. But when looking at Nevada standards, obviously like a piece of Nevada does their standards a little differently when it comes to Common Core. Like the Common Core ELA standards are built right into our social science standards. And so the first one was looking at just rigorous academic discussions. Because of the way that I developed the lesson plan, I used roundtables throughout it, both smaller roundtables and then a larger end roundtable, depending on, teacher's discretion. But in those roundtables, it's all about discussing multiple viewpoints, which when we look at the way I did my lesson plan, my compelling question is like, who is most responsible for the genocide in Rwanda? So we can look at, there are multiple different factions that were responsible. Who's most responsible, which I think that needs a conversation. It's not just what students think. Like there should be a conversation around that. So that was like the first overarching standard. And then the next standard is looking at understanding different characteristics of like causes of contemporary issues throughout the world. And so obviously this falls into that contemporary time period. The genocide in Rwanda, definitely an issue. And if you continue looking at what is happening in Rwanda today, there's still these pieces. Like Rwanda is not in a state of peace necessarily from a critical lens. And so looking at just causes of what's going on with Rwanda then and now. And then I really like one of our standards that I have not come across in either California or Illinois. One of the Nevada standards is actually looking at reactions to oppression, human rights violations, and genocide. Like that is a specific standard in Nevada. And I was like, this fits. This is the standard, right? Like there is no arguing into how this fits. It is literally in the standard itself. And then the last standard that I covered, again, I really like this and haven't come across it necessarily in other standards I've looked at or other states, is analyzing causes and consequences of the radicalization of individuals and groups. And so when we look at any genocide is radicalization of groups. Like people don't commit mass murders. People don't go out and kill their neighbors or their neighbors' children if they're not radicalized. And so again, that standard is just beautifully fit to what Hotel Rwanda was about, and the genocide within Rwanda. So those were those are the standards that I focus on, even on the PowerPoint, were those Nevada standards, because they just fit so beautifully well.
Yep. And for the listeners, as with all of our podcasts, you will have access to a PowerPoint with Leona's connection to the standards that you can use as a guide if you wanted to replicate this lesson in your own classroom. You also did a really good job of finding movie clips from the film to match those standards. Can you talk a little bit more about those specific clips you found and how they relate?
Yeah, so I focused on 4 different clips, and the title of the clips I actually pulled from the film. So as I was watching the film and pausing it, it beautifully gave me the titles. And so the first clip is called Hutu versus Tutsi. And so when we look at the Rwandan genocide, the main focus was the Hutu committing genocide against the Tutsi. And in this clip, it is talking about the development of these 2 groups. And it's a very short, about a 2-minute clip or so, and it's a brief, just that the Belgians created it when they were there under colonial rule, and it was literally based on skin color, so how light you were, length of noses. So it does like a very brief description of, like, I mean, if you want to equate it kind of to the Holocaust and that chart of, well, are you Jewish based on the length of your nose? And then it's a nice flip. So the journalist who's asking some questions then turns to 2 younger women and asks, are you Hutu or Tutsi? And one says she's a Hutu, and the other one says she's a Tutsi. And he's like, but you could be twins.
Mm.
And so it highlights, like, how do you know who people are? And this breakdown of, like, why do we even have this system of these 2 different ethnicities? And so I really like that clip and chose that clip because it connects so well to colonialism and the fact that, we think about continuity and change, and we think about cause and effect. The Rwandan genocide wasn't just didn't happen. Like, there is a history of why these 2 groups of people have these tensions. And then also, at the same time, there is no reason to have these 2 groups. Like, they really are the same people. And so that's the first clip that I chose. The second clip is called No Rescue. And so in this short clip, Paul, the hotelier, is talking with a general from the UN. And the general flat out tells them, like, we're not here to rescue you. We're not here to stop this. We are here to get our citizens out, and only our citizens out. So implying that it's white people who will be saved. And that it is a very, when we think about the language used in it, there is some crude language used in the sense that the general, the UN general, makes a distinction between, I won't use the language, but like Africans who are from Europe or Africans who live in the United States. There's that distinction. And the general says, you are even lower than them. And therefore, you're not worth the lives possibly lost. And it's not necessarily the perspective of the general. I want to make that clear. It's not necessarily the general is saying, I don't think you're worth it. It's we, the UN, we, the powers that provide support to the UN. We don't think so. We don't think you're worthy enough to possibly, have our own sons or, our own lives killed because of you. You can all die, but we can't.
Mm.
And so, again, I like that clip because it highlights almost that, again, that turning of the blind eye. To what extent could the genocide in Rwanda have been prevented if, powers that, what is the UN's purpose if not but to help when it comes to human rights violations? And then it comes to the question of, well, then whose human rights do the UN care about? And so I just thought it was a really good clip to kind of highlight the response of the rest of the world. The next clip is titled The Fog Clears. And in this clip, Paul leaves the hotel to go get supplies. He is using bribes and he's using his connections to continue to try to provide food and resources to those who he is, supporting at the hotel. And as he leaves with resources, he's driving and it's foggy, right? And the fog starts to lift. And he is on this road and he stops and he gets out of his vehicle, and the road is just covered with dead bodies.
Mm.
And so it's, even though, like I said, the movie does cover the 100 days of the genocide, it very much so focuses on what happens in that hotel and what is going on with Paul's family. But in this very moment, it does such a brilliant job of highlighting the trauma that is going on and the death tolls that are going on, without actually having to see the severe violence. So it's, because again, with even high school children or teenagers, it can be really difficult to see people being slaughtered.
Mhm.
And so this is the aftermath of a slaughtering. And so I just thought that was a great clip to be like, okay, again, when we're looking at who's responsible, who's the people committing these mass murders, and then the toll that that takes. How do you get out of your vehicle and see that?
Mhm.
And then the last clip is titled "Last Convoy," and this is it's one of the final scenes where the UN is actually leading the refugees out of the hotel to take them to a refugee camp. So it's about, again, 1,200 people on this last convoy. And again, this is the clip. They're all leaving. They're being protected by the UN, and additionally, the Tutsi rebel forces are also leading their way because they are, in this scene, being shot at by Hutu militia. And so you have the Tutsi rebel forces kind of clearing the path, because from the UN, there were not many UN soldiers. And so they definitely needed additional support to try to make sure that no one was killed on their way to the refugee camp. And so then that is the final piece the final clip that I chose.
Great. Thanks for explaining that. That was wonderful. And just correct me if I'm wrong. Don Cheadle plays Paul. Is that correct? Or no?
Oh, good question.
But
Yes,
Paul.
yes,
The
thank
other
you. I'm
Paul says yes.
I'm so bad. If my husband was here, he could give you the entire breakdown of the
Yeah.
cast.
Well, Don Cheadle is an amazing actor. Prior to Marvel, no offense to Marvel, we actually have a book, shameless plug, coming out about Marvel movies and how they can be used in Hollywood history. But Don Cheadle, I'm sure, did an amazing job. I haven't really seen the movie. I looked at the clips, but I believe it's Don Cheadle. He's an amazing actor. And you brought up a great point about when we do these lesson plans. These are not scripted curriculum, right? We're not telling a teacher to go step by step by step. We write it step by step to help a teacher bring this to their classroom, but we certainly want teachers to adapt these lessons based on the learning needs of their students, the rules they have with their school district, et cetera, et cetera. So I think with having 4 clips, you do a great job of giving teachers that choice to show all 4, maybe 1, maybe 2, based on, again, the needs of their students as well as the rules they have to follow in their school district. Okay, well, let's kind of move on to step 2. Step 2 is develop an interesting question. And the premise of Hollywood or history is that interesting question, or what we say with the NCSS framework, the compelling question: how accurate is this film? If it's 100% Hollywood, it means everything about the film is inaccurate. If it's 100% history, everything about the film is like you were there. It's very factual, very accurate, or more than likely, as we found out throughout the this series, is somewhere in the middle, right? So that is kind of the compelling question: how accurate is the film using the Hollywood or history continuum? However, every lesson plans have supporting questions or guiding questions to help students with this analysis. So, Leona, can you tell us more about the guiding questions that you selected for this lesson?
Yeah, so first starting off, I know I've already mentioned my compelling question. It was, who was most responsible for the Rwandan genocide? And I like the most piece because we can argue that there are multiple different factions responsible for it. And then so leading into more of those guiding questions is asking, my first one is like asking students, what events led to this genocide? Okay, and then how did each event do so? So what's the event and how does it lead us to the genocide? So when we can stem it back, again, colonialism, and look at those pieces all the way up to the assassination of the president right before the genocide happened. So what are some of those main events that lead us to the genocide? The next one is, how is the Rwandan genocide an example of global interconnectedness? Because if we're looking at the different factions and who may or may not be responsible, we do know obviously colonialism is an example of global interconnectedness, and then as well as the UN's participation and what roles the UN were asked to take on when it was established. And then going with that question was, to what extent was global interconnectedness a help and or a hindrance for Rwandans? Next, it was although Rwanda was an independent country during the genocide, how did the footprint of imperialism remain? Again, going back to that like change in continuity. The next one was, how did the ethnic groups of Hutu and Tutsi come to exist in such a polar capacity? Because again, this is where that radicalization comes in. They're viewed as so opposite, even though we can argue they're not. But why did we get there? How did we get there? Why didn't Western countries come to the aid of the Tutsi during the genocide? And then lastly, how were Hutu members of the community so easily able to kill their neighbors, including children? Because there was, I mean, the number of children killed is just astronomical. And it's how do we, a lot of times when we think about being a human, and when I talk to my students about this, they're so appalled. Like, how do you do that? How do you just pick up a machete and kill a 3-year-old? Like, it's so hard to fathom how that can come to be. And it doesn't matter, I feel like, what genocide we look at, it's how are people capable of this? And so I really wanted students to look at kind of that radicalization process, and kind of the steps of genocide that happened within Rwanda. So those are my guiding questions that students will either be answering or thinking about, because sometimes, again, depending on how we run the lesson, sometimes it's just think about this. You might not have to write about it, but I want you to think about it because it's going to inform then your final discussion or your final writing piece.
Yeah, thank you for that. And Paul, just to kind of bring you back in with your expertise on trauma and teaching trauma, these are very powerful questions to study this film. I just think that this is important to tell our teacher listeners. Do you have any recommendations when it comes to teaching or asking these type of questions with such a traumatic film and a traumatic event as well?
Great question. So I'm reminded of a recent conversation I had with, these were colleagues, these were all adults I was talking to, involved in some kind of education field. And a couple of them were talking about films that they had watched in some previous decade and how they had certain images seared into their minds and how they couldn't unsee them. And there was maybe 6 or 8 of us around the table, and so people had different perspectives. This was not a consistent narrative, but there were a few people. And incidentally, my wife was not at the table, but she would be in this category too, of people who are like, I just can't unsee that. I don't want to watch certain things. So I really appreciated Leona's example of like bodies, or not seeing the act of killing, as Leona just mentioned in the Rwandan genocide. Yeah, we're talking about machetes. Like this is really graphic violence. And so I agree. I'll go back to both the developmental piece, but then also, Scott, you named a really important dynamic around what are sort of the social norms in your context, and how are they codified into rules in a certain school district or university. But beyond sort of what is the rule, what will hurt or re-traumatize or re-traumatize certain students who you have, or what will invoke concern from parents or caregivers, for example. So all of those pieces are very contextual, and I just want to highlight those points that you all illustrated so beautifully. The goal here is not to introduce new trauma or to make your students feel uncomfortable. The goal is to talk about what's already there. So, for some educators, they'll watch the 4 clips that Leona just described and choose not to show the one where Don Cheadle gets out of the vehicle. For others, that will be a very powerful example that helps bring it to life for certain students of certain ages, etc., where maybe it's too abstract, and that helps to clarify what is it that we're talking about. The other piece that I just made a note to myself, about, I really appreciate this contextualization that Leona's been illustrating for us. That this is not one person did this one bad thing, but our questions, our compelling question, our supporting questions, the evidence we provide needs to be a holistic picture. So yes, it's mapped onto learning objectives, and those are anchored in curriculum and standards that and skills that we want students to develop. Also, in addition to being anchored in those standards and that curriculum, we need to then be thinking about what's the context of the story in which the trauma is taking place, and how does that bigger story help to provide evidence of the resistance and the resilience that is a part of this fuller picture. Even when the worst possible things are happening, like a genocide, that's kind of, pretty far end of the spectrum in terms of what we introduce in classrooms, there is evidence of resistance, like this, the main character, the protagonist of Hotel Rwanda. And there's evidence of resilience. People who have experienced the worst possible thing, like seeing people they love being killed right in front of their faces, and we imagine that we would just keel over. Like, I can't imagine living through this. I don't want to imagine it. And we probably would tell ourselves, someone who's lived through that could understandably just be totally incapacitated, even not physically, but just psychologically and emotionally. So the fact that there are characters in the movie who are persisting, who are seeking refuge, who are supporting each other, who are advocating to, the non-responsive UN soldiers, is evidence of the resilience in the face of the worst human atrocities. Now, again, we don't tell that story in order to teach students that humans can survive anything, because to tell that in a vacuum is introducing unnecessary trauma. But when we have curriculum that includes the traumagenic events, we need to also then pair it with and talk about, this is evidence of resistance, this is evidence of resilience. And I really appreciate how Leona's been doing that by sort of zooming out and saying, this is a part of a bigger story, and that helps us to see how the pieces fit together and how people have been resisting and have been resilient across the bigger story, not only in this one country, right? That it's not just the genocide, it's also a part of a bigger story. And that sort of contextualization, that attention to sort of the structural and systemic elements is a part of that sort of that trauma responsive or trauma aware teaching.
Yeah, and then thanks, Paul and Leona. Like I said, I just wanted to jump in real quick. I mean, this is like I said, very very, yeah, we use the term difficult history. This is very difficult history for our students, and again, just want to help our teacher listeners. Because I think this type of story should be taught, should be told. This lesson plan is amazing and should be used if you're looking at genocide. But just want to make sure that our listeners are aware of ways that they can bring this topic up in a way that's not going to be really traumatic to certain students, but to also get the point across. And Leona, I like the idea of not seeing the actual violence, but seeing the result of the violence as your clip, which may allow a teacher to get their point across when it comes to that, but not in a gory or graphic way, just to get a reaction from students or something like that. So thank you for that. So yeah, let's move on to step 3. So step 3 is selecting your sources. Again, with the Hollywood or history strategy, we want the teacher to at least use one primary source and one secondary source to help students analyze the accuracy of the film. So Leon, can you talk a little bit more about some of those sources that you selected, both primary and secondary?
Yeah, as I thought back on this, I remembered the rabbit hole I went down. There's so many phenomenal sources that existed. But to start off with, in the movie, and throughout the movie, the radio plays, it's like almost a character in and of itself. It's just almost, I don't want to say it's on all the time in the background, but you can hear the radio station. And the radio station that's being played is a Hutu radical radio station. It's, the abbreviation is RTLM. I can try to pronounce it, but it's in French, and we're gonna skip that. And so anyway, in the film, the radio station is like this character. So I thought that would be a great place to start. What was the accuracy of almost that radio station that's playing? And then how does it fit with the clips? And so I started going, searching for that. And Concordia University actually has a database of a plethora of transcripts from this time period in Rwanda, both looking at the more Hutu radicalized radio station, as well as the Tutsi rebel station, which is the RPF. And so that is not presented in the film. In the film, the radio playing in the background is all from the Hutu side. So I was interested to also find the transcripts of this opposite side, of the Tutsi side. And so that's kind of where I started, was with those transcripts. And then I'm well aware that with the Holocaust Museum, the United States Holocaust Museum, they not only cover the Holocaust, but they have a part of their site that is dedicated to genocides in other countries and human rights violations in other countries. And so I went there, and they have a plethora of both primary and secondary sources covering the genocide in Rwanda. So I then kind of went through what they offered and used a lot of that as jumping boards to see what best aligned with the video clips, as well as just to give further insight into what happened in Rwanda. So like my secondary sources offer more of that overview in some capacities, so that students have a little bit of a better understanding of just what was happening. So that was like the rabbit hole I went down. Mm-hmm. And then in choosing my sources, looking at that first video clip, the Hutu versus Tutsi, it's a transcript from, or a portion of a transcript, because the transcripts can go into hundreds of pages long. So I gave a very specific look at these pages. You can choose a paragraph, you can choose a page, but here's kind of the best few pages to look at. And this transcript is an excerpt from the RTLM, and it focuses on kind of the dehumanization, right? And that's definitely a piece of genocide that in any genocide we see, is the ability to dehumanize someone, equating them to vermin or roaches, or, you can think of all these sort of different terms that we can use that essentially make a human not human anymore. And that definitely ties into the piece of how can you kill your neighbor? Well, if you don't see them as a human and you see them as a cockroach, I step on cockroaches all the time without a blink of an eye. And so it just ties into that dehumanization piece. So that was the first primary source that I went to that goes with that first clip. And then looking at my secondary source, it was looking at just an overarching discussion of the development of the Hutu versus Tutsi ethnicities. I'm going to use that term lightly, but how these distinctions came about throughout history. And so those are my first two sources with clip one. For my second clip with No Rescue, when looking at, again, the lack of involvement or full involvement by the UN and Western powers, my primary source, or is actually from General Ramiro Dalier. He was awarded a medal from the U.S. Holocaust Museum. And it's the Elie Wiesel Medal from the author of Night. And it's his speech. It's his acceptance speech. And in his speech, again, it's about 18 minutes, but I give here, these are the best three minutes to watch. He does talk about how the UN wanted to pull out even sooner. And he said, no, it was immoral for, the handful of troops they had left to leave. And so it's a great source, I thought, to support both sides, right? So you can say that the West didn't help in many capacities based on them wanting to pull out, but then you see this single general who defies orders and says, no, I'm staying. And so that resistance, that, piece of, I am going to help my fellow humans. And so that was the primary source for that second clip. And then for the secondary source, looking at a speech from President Clinton, and he gave a speech actually in 2012 where he argued, or maybe not argues, but he states that we should have done more. And we should have done more. And so looking at the recognition of, at this point, it's almost 10 years after the genocide, and the president of the United States at the time is going, or, at the time of the genocide is going, we didn't do enough. So again, just looking at what was the role of the West in all, not the West, but maybe Western powers in all of this. And then for the third one, which is the fog clears, again, I use a transcript from the radio station. This one is from Radio Rwanda. And this clip, again, looks at just the dehumanization, the brutality, kind of the call for radicalization, the call to murder. And then I also utilized the Hutu 10 Commandments. So there were 10 Commandments written, which we tend to think about Christianity and Christian values. And so it takes the concept of a 10 Commandment and put it to what you need to do as a Hutu. And part of it is that radicalization and, kind of weeding out those who aren't as good as you. And then moving into that fourth clip, the last convoy, I use, again, another excerpt from the radio stations. This one is from Radio Muhambra, which is the rebel group. And again, just looking at with this tying into what they were doing and what they were advocating on the radio to help clear out, or not clear out, but help refugees, and looking at just what's going on and how do we help save people in this massive genocide, because 800,000 people are killed in 100 days. And so it just ties in with the moving of people, trying to get them into safer places. And then looking at for another secondary source with this one is very, it's a long source, but I, again, give 3 pages to use. But it is the historical perspective of different factors that led to the genocide, which also, again, one of the pieces it looks at is not just what goes on throughout the last, say, 100 years in Africa and in Rwanda, but also then lack of responses and then the response as well, right? So there's a lack of response, but clearly in the movie we do see, and even in history, we know that about 1,200 people were saved from this hotel. And so there is a response as well. As much as there's a lack of response, there is a response. And so those 3 pages just kind of cover the historical context of both what led us there as well as some of those responses.
Great, thank you. And again, listeners, you will have access to these sources, some links and some just the titles and the authors, just so you can find it if you do want to use this lesson in your classroom. Okay, so next we have the develop a graphic organizer. And again, as we've said in prior episodes, I developed a basic organizer that is used in nearly every lesson in the series. Just a basic organizer with 4 boxes. One helps your students analyze the primary source. One helps your students analyze the movie. One helps your students analyze the secondary source. And then at the bottom, they have a place to write their own conclusions about how accurate they think the film is. Again, standard in almost every lesson in the series. But we do often encourage our authors to make up additional organizers if possible, and if they feel like it fits their lesson better. And I do see, Leona, that you did come up with kind of a different organizer. So can you talk a little bit more about the organizer that you selected for your lesson? And again, listeners, you will be able to see this organizer on the PowerPoint.
So one of the organizers, I put 2 of them up here. One of the organizers that, it's not mine, but I've used it for many, many, many years, is called Soapstones. And it's utilized a lot for primary source analysis to get students to think about, right, the context of the source. And so Soapstones stands for speaker. So who's your author? And it's not just who's the name of the author, right? But really, what's their role in this? How much do they maybe know about the what was going on? What's their potential bias, their perspective, right? So if it's a Hutu writing it or speaking it versus a Tutsi, they're going to have a different perspective. So you have speaker, you have the occasion. So what is going on in the world or in their region at the time? Next one is audience. Who is this written for? And I always talk with my students when we discuss the audience that is very important. We don't tend to think of it as being important, but the way, like I always tell my students, the way I am going to write something to a friend of mine is going to look a lot different than if I'm writing an email to my principal. It
Right.
might be the same exact information that I'm sharing,
Right.
but it is going to come across very differently. So, who is the audience? What's the goal of writing this then to that audience? And then what's the purpose? So, again, what are they trying to do with this? And then what's the subject? So, what are they trying to convey in it? Right? How does this relate to the audience? And then lastly, what's the tone of the passage? Is it lighthearted and happy? Is it, I'm thinking of some of the dehumanization pieces of the transcripts that they will read. What is that tone? Like, it's certainly not happy. Is it angry? Is it coming from a sense of, nationalistic identity, And so then students have to try to figure out what does this almost feel like? Because again, emotions and the way anything is written or spoken, that plays such a part on how then it inspires other people. So that's the soapstone. It's used for primary sources. Could you use it for a secondary source? I guess maybe in some capacities, especially if we're looking at, who wrote the secondary source. Is there a bias to the secondary source? What's the perspective of the secondary source? We definitely can, but it's overarching is used more for primary sources. The second one that I give is actually a shorter graphic organizer. So it has 5 different pieces and it's just a chart. And so you would just go through the chart looking at the 5 pieces. So the first one of that is document information. So students just kind of summarize or bullet point what's in the document. The next one is historical context. So looking at, again, how does this fit into that broader history? Intended audience, so similar to that soapstone. Purpose, and then connection to. And I did like that piece of the connection to. How does this one source connect to the larger topic we're looking at? So if I was going to use in my classroom all 8 of those sources, both the primary and the secondary, how do each of those how are they interrelated? How do they connect to the Rwanda genocide? How does it connect to maybe our compelling question or one of our supporting questions? And so then just looking at helping students make those connections across sources.
Great, thank you. And like I said, yes, you'll see both of the examples on the PowerPoint as well. So moving on to step 5. So after you have selected your standards, after you have selected the film clips, after you found your primary and secondary sources, then you actually get to show the movie. And we've discussed some of these scenes already in detail. But Leona, do you want to add anything else, maybe for the teachers who may want to use these clips, anything like that, from the clips that you use for your lesson plan?
So one of the things that I would suggest, again, they don't have to do it my way, but because the clips can be heavy and the supporting questions are deep, I would suggest if you're going to use all 4 clips or multiple clips, show the clip and then analyze the sources that go along with the clip. Have students really start to analyze that piece of the lesson plan, that piece of the genocide, before you move on to the next one. Because in doing that, it's helping students build that contextualization. It's helping students understand. Because in each piece, I ask students, to what extent is this one piece Hollywood or history? So it's building so that then this way they have a better response for that compelling question, right? It's just kind of that scaffolding for students. So I definitely recommend going that route instead of showing all 4 clips and then jumping into sources. Like, it can be overwhelming to watch those clips, even though they're short. It's 10 minutes of a lot,
Mhm.
a lot of trauma introduced. And then it also, like, if you go clip sources, it also breaks it up for students, and helps them better process.
Yeah, and you've been kind enough on the PowerPoint to give the timestamps and the titles that you saw when you were watching the was it DVD, Netflix? Did you
Amazon Prime.
Amazon Prime? Amazon Prime. Okay, we'll give them a free plug. So Amazon Prime. Do you not to put you on the spot, but do you happen to know if any of these clips are available on YouTube? Did you get a chance to check that out or no?
Some of the clips are, but what I have found, especially now in, it's been what, 4 years, 5 years, it's been a
Many,
while,
many years.
is that sometimes the clip is available and then it's not available. And then because of that copyright piece. So it just kind of depends on if you're going to be able to find it or not.
Yeah, and you bring up a good point for those who are reading the books. Obviously, these books do get aged after a while. We did encourage our authors to put timestamps if they had the actual media, or again, if you can watch it, in streaming. Obviously, streaming services pick up movies, they drop movies, et cetera, et cetera. YouTube. So again, I think what you did on it that was great is you give kind of a summary of what the scene is about, which again you'll see on the PowerPoint when you download it. So that should help you as a teacher locate some of these scenes, either again through Amazon Prime, physical media, or YouTube, and that you get enough information to determine if that's the clip that is discussed. Or you can certainly use these as guides and use your own clips if you want to, add to this lesson. Well, thank you on that. So the next step is step 6, and that's when we encourage, like you said, our students to read the secondary source. I like how you said that for these clips, it's good to do the clip, then the sources, and the clips and the sources, not all at one time. Any other ideas that you want to provide to our listeners about the secondary sources that you have provided for this lesson?
Just in keeping, so first of all, textbooks, I would be very cautious in using what textbooks provide. My textbook that I had at the time was extremely old, and it was the Rwandan genocide was literally like 5 sentences. And so just being, I present no textbook usage because of that. Like, it's just, so if you have a textbook and you want to utilize it, just be cautious or cognizant of what it presents. And then recognizing too that, like, any of the video clips I have, I would recommend downloading the transcripts. And if you're only, you can even just download the transcripts and provide students with the piece from the video clips. And that's going to help our emergent bilingual students. It's going to help students who, maybe like they watch the clip and they're so intently watching that they're like, oh, I missed pieces. Like, I know I caught the essence of it, but I missed pieces. So downloading transcripts, utilizing transcripts. And then feel free, I again give for both of the videos kind of what timestamps I think would be good if you want to keep it short, but feel free to use the whole clips as well. I mean, both of them are really, to me, and are really moving clips. And so feel free to utilize those whole clips if you have the time and if you want to. And then I would definitely just recommend reading them beforehand. Don't just print and give, for the simple fact that all of our students, every classroom is going to be made up with different students. I think about where I live now, we have many Syrian refugees, students who have seen their parents killed in front of them. I might not choose a portion of one of these secondary sources to give to that classroom that I might give, or I might have given to my Vegas classroom where maybe they weren't exposed to that so firsthand. So definitely just be aware and go through any of these sources before you just hand them off to your students to pick what's really best for them.
Yeah, and you bring up a good point when it comes to the textbook. Obviously, when we wrote the U.S. history textbook, a lot of a lot of the movies and lessons were based on stuff that you could find in your state mandated textbook, Battle of Bunker Hill, Alamo, et cetera, et cetera. But obviously, there are going to be topics that may not be even covered in your state mandated textbook. I haven't looked at a world history textbook in a while, so I'm not sure if the Rwandan genocide is or is not. But you certainly, we tell teachers this is a good place to start. Some of these topics, you maybe will find a paragraph or two, but obviously, if it's not there, that's why we ask our authors to provide other sources, secondary sources. So, Leona, you did a great job of offering that to the readers, because again, I'm not sure how much is covered in those more recent world history textbooks about this genocide.
Yeah. And then can I just add, I
No,
did
sure.
add, it doesn't tie into any of the clips, but there is a source from the Encyclopedia Britannica that just gives an overview of the genocide. So I think it's a good place to start, especially if you don't have a textbook that has it, or it's just not deep enough. It doesn't tie to any clips, but it's a good place to just introduce your students to what the genocide was before maybe getting into those clips.
Definitely, yep. And we know again, there's a big debate about Wikipedia, stuff like that. But just for that introduction piece, check the sources. Wikipedia does have sources that you can click on to see how accurate those are.
Yeah.
But yeah, but any type of like online encyclopedia could be a good, if you don't have it in your textbook, could be, like you said, a great place to start before you dive into these additional sources that, again, every lesson in the Hollywood History series has. So definitely kind of keep that in mind. So step 7 is after you analyze the film, after you analyze the secondary source, then you look at the primary source. And again, you did a great job of describing these primary sources that you selected. But is there anything else you want to add for our teacher listeners about using these primary sources?
Kind of what I went off of with the secondary sources to just review them, be cognizant, as well as some of these primary sources are extensive. So you could always, if you don't, if the chosen passages like that I put in there, if you're like, I don't really, that's not what I want to use. They are extensive. You can do a search for keywords that maybe are going to fit better to what you want to introduce your students to. And so just recognize that there is a plethora of information in these sources, and the chosen passages I utilize do not have to be the ones you use.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay, so now we come to the meat, if you will, of the Hollywood history strategy, determining how accurate we think these clips are. However, I always want to say on this podcast that remember, as a teacher, your goal is to get your students to use the inquiry based lesson in order to come up with their own conclusions by analyzing the film using primary and secondary sources and coming up with a percentage or some way of letting you know how accurate they think the film is, whether it's 100% Hollywood, 100% history, or somewhere in the middle. Now, we may have listeners who are not teachers. They may just love film, or they may just love history, or some combination. So, Leona, I'm going to not bury the lead. We'll come to that towards the end where we get your expert opinion on how accurate you think the movie is. But I do want to say step 8 is when you go through the process, you let your students actually make these decisions based on, again, their own analysis of these sources. But again, for our non-teacher listeners, because we don't want teachers to just tell the kids what they think. We want the kids to do it. But for our non-teacher listeners, we'll come back in a second to talk about how accurate we think this film is. But finally, we do some sort of conclusion. Now, obviously, we do have something like a line of contention or a four corners approach, where you have kids, after they do their writing about how accurate they think the film is, they could go to the board and stand in the continuum where they think it is and read out their answers to their classmates. Or they can get in four corners and talking in small groups about why they selected 100% Hollywood, 75% Hollywood, 50% Hollywood, 25%, etc. And that's one way we go about doing it. But obviously, as the idea of Hollywood history developed, many authors have added to that conclusion piece. Taking action, as we say in the Dimension 4 of the C3 framework. So, Leona, what did you do to conclude your lesson when it came to analyzing these clips and how accurate they are?
Yeah, I focused a lot on roundtable discussion. I like the idea of students having those conversations because, one, it's just a good skill to have that maybe in some ways our society is losing. Being able to have conversations with people who maybe don't agree with you. And this is something that, I mean, it's traumatic, it could be contentious, but it's not something my students are living in the moment, if that makes sense. So I think it makes it like we can build those skills of conversation. We can build the skills of how do we disagree properly? And then how do we listen? I think listening is such a key piece, and being willing to change your mind. If someone's arguing that the Hutu are totally responsible for this genocide, or in what case Hollywood or history is, um, being able to listen with the idea of you may change my mind. And so I like those roundtable conversations for that piece. And then I do have an extension for anyone who is like, well, I want to assess my students individually, a written portion. And that could be a single paragraph, it could be an essay. I mean, it really just depends on where your students are at and what you want from them.
Yeah, thank you. And again, like I said, you'll find when you read Paul's book or any book in the series that there are a variety of ways to close out these lessons after students have had the ability to make their own conclusions about the accuracy of the film or the film clips. So, speaking of which, the conclusion. All right. So, again, what do you think, Leona, as the expert in this film and then going through all these primary and secondary sources, if you had to put this on the continuum, what would you say, where does this film fall?
Okay, so this is the teacher in me. I could have 17 different answers for you.
Okay.
It depends on what are we really asking? Like, I mean, and then that's a big question. So if I'm only considering what's presented in the film and this emphasis on this hotelier and the hotel that he's utilizing to help save people, then I would say there is some accuracy to it. Some.
Right.
Now, if we're going to look at the 100 days of the genocide from the entire country perspective, it loses accuracy.
Mm.
If we're looking at the 100 years leading up to the genocide, that definitely sets the stage for the genocide, it loses even more accuracy. If we're considering the interconnectedness of the world, it loses more accuracy. Right? Because it's like to the question of how accurate can any film be in 2.5 hours covering 100 days of anything,
Mhm.
right? And so I'm like, it just continues to, right? So what am I focusing on? And the reason that I go with that is because I want my students to consider that as well. I don't want them to necessarily just, if they don't want to, if they want to focus just on this person that's being presented, this protagonist, then I want them to take that perspective and go, okay, well, this is how accurate I think it is. But another student who goes, well, they barely talked about the role of Belgium in all of this, then I want them to be able to take that perspective as well. And so again, it depends on where we want to, or how much of time and history do we want to consider with the genocide, and then to what extent does the film accurately portray that. I will say, are there pieces of truth? Definitely. Is it a biased truth? Yes. There's definitely omissions, right? It's not that it's necessarily wrong, but there are omissions. So, there's definitely been, especially since the film has come out, there has been, people writing and research that have been done that maybe Paul wasn't as heroic as the film makes him out to be. And there have been reports of him charging people. Right? In the film, he gives bills to everybody, but he doesn't actually necessarily collect money from them, right? So it's a front that he's still running this hotel. But there have been accounts where they're like, no, he was overcharging some people, and if they couldn't pay, he was kicking them out, which was essentially giving them an immediate death. So to what extent, right, that the film shows Paul very heroic, and there is a problem with presenting people as heroes because then we can never see fault in them. And so there's that piece. There is the piece of the film presents the Hutu as definitely the culprits of all of this, but they leave out much of that, the rebel forces and the invasion that happened and what role they had in the invasion of 1990. So it presents a small faction of the truth.
Right. Yeah.
Not, and so then, definitely the end scene, it's Hollywood. Yes. So people were saved. So there is truth to that, but I mean, it's presented in a very glorious fashion.
Yeah.
And, it's there are moving pieces of it and it is hard, but you can definitely tell that, Hollywood needs to wrap things up very nicely and
Right.
history doesn't.
Yes. Great point there. Like I should take that quote and just use it for every other podcast. But no, I think you're right. And honestly, going back to with our teacher hats, very similar description about Schindler's List. About was Schindler as heroic as he's portrayed in the film? What were his motives, et cetera, et cetera. And going back to us being teachers, you could certainly do comparative analysis between the two films, how they portray this quote unquote hero during a genocide, and really dive deeper into the real life story to see how much Hollywood added, to dramatize these people in a way just to make a good movie, as opposed to what actually really happened. I guess you could also do that with Rudy too, the movie Rudy about football. We talk a lot about football and golf in this podcast for some reason, so I'm thinking about Rudy and all the inaccuracies that he had as well. So you
Yeah.
definitely have these individuals that are heroic. I think it's important. I think it's important for our students to be able to understand that, yeah, you watch these movies, you feel great about this person, but you really need to do some analysis to see what were their motives, what did they actually do, how accurate this is, because we do want to see both sides of any historic figure, I think. So I think you bring up a good point.
Yeah, and I think from a student perspective, right, having worked with adolescents for so long and then even just being a parent now, I feel like when we glorify a person, our kids can never live up to that, right? So in the case of Schindler, or in the case of Paul, right, it's in Hotel Rwanda, it's not to take away what they did good. They did good. But if we only view them as ever doing good, then they can never do wrong. And so then how can a 15-year-old, if I'm thinking of teaching this in world history, how can a 15-year-old ever feel like they can help make a difference in the world if they never see a hero do something wrong? Because they are going to do something wrong, right? We all do. All good people make mistakes. Like
Mhm.
anyone we would equate to being a bad person does good things, right? Like it's not one or the other. And so if our students only ever see people make a difference, never do something wrong, they feel like I can never achieve that. I can never make a difference in my society because I'm not perfect. And so I like delving into these ideas of heroes to be like, no, they made a difference, right? They saved people. And sometimes we have to go, is the death of one worth saving 1,000? And that's a hard decision that needs to be made
Yeah.
in some of these, traumatic, horrible time periods. And so I just think that presenting it to our students in a way that heroes also have flaws helps them recognize that they can achieve amazing things as well, because they're not going to be perfect.
Yeah, I think that's the amazing point. And for those who, this idea of heroification is in movies. It's certainly in textbooks. So for those that haven't read Dr. James Lowen's "Lies My Teacher Told Me,"
Right.
RIP, he was one of my academic mentors. He actually read my dissertation and gave me handwritten notes about it. So I'll never, it's tough to say anything other than positive things about Jim Lowen. But he did write a lot about heroification in textbooks, and I think you can apply the same thing, obviously, to how people are portrayed in film. I think it's a really easy transition. So definitely recommend reading "Lies My Teacher Told Me." Even though it's not about film, you can certainly use the same ideas when it comes to these type of lessons. So thank you for talking about that. That was great. So to conclude, you did a great job again in the PowerPoint of providing your references, web links, primary sources, secondary sources, additional information. So listeners, you'll be able to access that in the show notes. But y'all have anything to promote? We'll start with Paul. Paul, anything you've written, presented, anything you've done recently that you'd like to let the audience know about?
Yeah, thanks so much, Scott. I do have two recent publications that build very much on this conversation. So one of them is actually in social education from about a year ago and focuses on the Israel-Hamas war. So another example of contemporary events that are so trauma-laden. And so the goal there is to build on that old, tried and true, sometimes purposefully shelved strategy of the KWL. What do you know? What do you want to know or learn? What have you learned? And to layer in there, how are you feeling? Both in terms of emotions, but also what are you feeling as you're engaging these conversations, as you're watching a film like Hotel Rwanda, as you're engaging news coverage of current events, listening to our bodies, listening to the whole person that each of us and each of our students is, not just ideas. And then that last piece that is in that article is trying to flesh out what you said a few minutes ago, actually, Scott, that what am I going to do with this? And that's an important part of naming and fostering resilience? What do we do with what we experience and have learned? The other article that's also going to be available, it is available, but that you can click on or find more about in the show notes, is in AERA Open. So I analyzed Virginia social studies standards, and the goal there was to provide more language around different kinds of trauma that is already in the curriculum that we teach. And so I want to give kudos to Scott, to my co-editor, Aaron Johnson, because that analysis, that article aligns very closely, builds very much on this book project and the introduction that Aaron and I wrote for this volume. One other quick promotion, my university does actually have a graduate certificate and a concentration in our master's program focused on trauma and resilience in education. And so if you want to learn more, you can find us at Eastern Mennonite University, emu.edu/GTE, Graduate Teacher Education, and find that link as well.
Awesome. Thanks, Paul. And just to add a little bit to it, first of all, to give credit where credit is due, Donna Ogle, 1982, made the KWL chart. I guess one of these days, I'm afraid that in 50 years, they'll be like, oh, Hollywood history. Who did that again? But 1982, we all use KWL chart. And that's interesting that you took a new spin on that, because it's certainly a standard, teaching tool that we all teach to our students. So that's great. See, this 50-year-old brain does remember some stuff. And the other thing is social education, as we said, actually in the last podcast, is the premier practitioner journal for the National Council for the Social Studies, focusing on secondary education. Very difficult to get an article in social education. So Paul, congratulations on that for your hard work. I look forward to reading that when I get social studies and young learners, so I have to actually find social education. Primarily, I teach elementary methods primarily, but I'll definitely take a look at that as well. So thank you, Paul. Leona, do you have anything you would like to promote?
Yeah, so recently I have been working on culturally relevant pedagogy in social sciences, as well as bringing real world context into social science classrooms. And so there are 2 books that I have featured chapters in. The first book actually is just published and hit Amazon about a month ago. The book is titled, Why Am I Learning This? Strategies for Increasing Real World Relevance in Secondary Classroom. And my chapter in it is titled Moving Beyond Facts, Bringing Real World Relevance into the Social Science Classroom to Enhance Student Engagement and Develop Critical Thinking Skills. Obviously, in a lot of the research I do, as well as other social studies or social science teacher educators, we find that many teachers are still lecturing in classrooms. And so this is a focus on how do we help kids better connect to the content through different strategies. And I like it because Hollywood and history actually does that, like using these strategies and utilizing film clips in classrooms actually does very much so connect easily to students because they're so familiar with just film in general. And then the second book that I have a featured chapter in is titled Pursuing Practical Change, Lesson Designs that Promote Culturally Responsive Teaching. And again, I do a chapter on how do we promote culturally responsive teaching in social studies and social sciences. And that is titled History is Not Static and Unchanging, Using Culturally Responsive Teaching to Develop Critical Social Science Thinking Skills and Active Citizenship. So again, just looking at different ways that promote more critical thinking skills in our history and social science classrooms. Because the more we lecture, we actually tell students what history is, as opposed to allowing them to determine what history is, right? If we lecture, we're not helping them become a historian or any sort of social scientist. We're literally giving them facts and asking them to regurgitate stuff. And so these are all just different, very practical strategies that teachers can take into their classroom and they can utilize tomorrow. So again, similar to the concepts of Hollywood and history, it's taking something into the classroom, not necessarily the hard, heavy research on the other side that I do that deals with, multiple regression and psychometrics. These are the very practical things you can take into your classroom.
Excellent. Well, congratulations on those publications. Always in our world, always tough to get those things. So congratulations on that. And so just to kind of conclude, as listeners know, we do have a email address. So if you have any questions for Paul about his book or his work, or Leona about this particular lesson or her work as well, please send us an email at hollywooderhistorypodcast@gmail.com. Once again, the email address is hollywooderhistorypodcast@gmail.com. And not to speak for Paul and Leona, but I'm sure they'd be happy to answer those questions that you have about this lesson or their work. So thank you so much for being on the podcast. It was a pleasure talking to you both, and best of luck over the next few months when it comes to your research and your teaching.
Thanks so much, Scott.
Thank you, Scott. This is a wonderful experience.
Awesome. Hollywooder History volumes are now published by Emerald Publishing out of the UK. All volumes can be purchased on Emerald's website or anywhere books are sold. If the innovative ideas discussed in the podcast have led you or a family member to consider earning an undergraduate or graduate degree in education from Central Michigan University, we encourage you to review the links in the show notes or contact host Dr. Scott Roberts at rober4s@cmich.edu. We offer undergraduate degrees in general and special education at the elementary level, secondary disciplines including social studies, and graduate degrees in curriculum and instruction, instructional technology, literacy, health and PE, and special education. We also have accelerated teacher certification programs for those with undergraduate degrees in something other than education who want to become excellent teachers in the state of Michigan.